Mine is the first visit of a Canadian Prime Minister to China in nearly a decade. The world has changed much since that last visit. And I believe the progress that we have made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order.
Gotta love the way he said that, huh? The new world order. It's like Hulk Hogan when he went rogue, right? But this is a different new world order. Tom Mulcair is standing by, former leader of the NDP, and of course, analyst here at CJAD. Our feature brought to you by Guaranteed Industries, reminding you a Canner heat pump or furnace. Yep. Got plenty of time to stay warm through the rest of the winter, 514-342-3400. Or you can go online, guaranteedindustries.com, serving Montrealers since 1957. So, Tom, what do you make of the new world order that Mark Carney was talking about today?
Well, I think that he's spot on. I think that he's describing the change that we've gone through, in particular in the past year, since the arrival of Trump 2.0. But I also think that if you go back since the last trip of a Canadian Prime Minister to China, of course, we had Trump 1.0 for 4 years. Then we had a pandemic, and then we had Trump 2.0. So I think the world is changing very rapidly, and he's right. Just to give you, to try to give him a bit of a break on the fact that he was speaking in clipped words, when you're in a foreign country and you're speaking through interpreters, you are told to break up your sentences the interpreters can keep pace. So that's what he was up to there. But you and I can keep talking at our normal clip.
Oh, good. Okay. By the way, I thought he was trying to imitate for a second Hulk Hogan, because you don't have to be a huge wrestling fan to remember this classic moment, Tom.
This right here, you can call this the new world order.
I mean, I'm just saying, maybe we don't know he's a closet wrestling fan. I'm not entirely sure. What does this mean to you, though? Let's be serious for a second and talk about what he's referring to here.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, when any previous visit was held by a Canadian Prime Minister to China, you always had people saying, correctly, are you going to raise the issue of human rights? What about the Uyghur Muslim minority in Western China? What about Hong Kong today? You talk about. So those are things that you would expect, and really reasonable voices like Erwin Kotler's saying, hey, you should really, keep that at the top of the agenda. Carney is not saying no to that, but he's also taking note of the fact that south of the border, black shirts with covered faces are shooting bombs in the street. People are being killed. Children are having guns pointed in their faces as they go through a Target store. They become targets. So this is the new world order, and it becomes increasingly difficult to see how it's possible to make your first point of contact with another country, lecturing them on human rights, when our still closest trading partner, the United States, is going through a moment that even Josh Rogan is saying is extremely serious. Joe Rogan, sorry, with regard to human rights. I mean, the terms being used right now to describe what Trump is doing are very harsh, harken back to another era. They're not all wrong. And so I think it's part of dealing with that new world. How is Canada, or how would the United States react to China invading Taiwan tomorrow? After Trump invaded Venezuela, kidnapped the leader, who was a scoundrel, who stole his election. We all know that stuff is true. But what moral ground do you have left? You either stay on the moral high ground, or you're going for the lowest common denominator, and that's where we are in the world right now. So Canada's going to continue to be a morally upright country with good, strong, democratically elected leadership, and we're going to have a very pragmatic approach, and those were the key words that Carney was using today. And he did answer the question when asked, and he said, yes, I did raise the issue of human rights, but I do it behind closed doors, and it's not going to become the most contentious issue in this trip.
By the way, it's worth pointing out, I asked our listeners today, Tom, if given this Chinese EV deal that they announced today, if people would consider buying these. And I understand, to your point about, the Uyghurs and China. First, it's a communist government. We all know this. Someone pointed out, well, they're not our friends, to which someone else texted, we trade with a lot of countries that we don't necessarily consider friends, right? So let's keep that in mind. And also, let's keep the $3 billion that this deal actually provides to Canadian farmers. That's not to be overlooked.
It's not to be overlooked, and we shouldn't forget that it's actually more than that. because not only are those farmers going to be able to do the work that they love to do in their businesses and sell their canola, for example, but we're going to stop asking every other Canadian taxpayer to subsidize them.
Right.
Because, of course, the government had to move in because it was their move to put, we decided we were going to put in the same 100% tariff as the Americans. By the way, this was Trudeau and Biden. It was before the re-election, just before, weeks before the re-election of Trump. But we never had any proof that there was dumping. I mean, this is simply affirmed as if it's a fact that the Chinese were making these things far too cheap. There had to be dumping, which is actually something that allows you to get rid of the normal rules of international trade. And there's never been any proof of that. It was just an affirmation. And yes, you can get something very similar to a $70,000 Tesla. It's a $35,000 BYD, and it's a very similar car. Very similar indeed. Some have pointed out that it's extraordinarily similar, given the fact that those Teslas were being built in China.
In China, right. All right, let me move on to talk. There are some other stories in the news sometimes we forget. The Federal Court of Appeal ruling today. It was, in fact, unreasonable for the Liberal government under Justin Trudeau to use the Emergencies Act 4 years ago to break up the Freedom Convoy. And I guess my question, Tom, is what comes of this decision?
Well, certainly it's going to go to the Supreme Court and we'll get another decision there, and then it'll be sort of ancient history by then. But to people who brought Dunkin' Donuts and coffee to, like Pierre Poilievre, to the people holding the line with their trucks and, their shutdown, the Freedom Convoy, they get some satisfaction here because you've got a very strong judgment by Mr. Justice Mosley of the Federal Court of Appeal saying, no, this is not reasonable. It wasn't transparent. It wasn't intelligible. You couldn't understand what the reasoning was. And, I've talked with people who were involved in the decisions around this, and it goes back several years, as we all know. And one of the things that was said to me was that there was simply nobody in charge. The police in the city of Ottawa had absolutely, completely, totally failed in terms of their leadership, not the individual officers, of course. It was an abject failure. Their chief of police quit right in the middle of this thing. He was that incompetent. So that left, there was always overlapping jurisdictions, but it's still there. You have the whole parliamentary precinct where this was taking place, in large part. That's governed by another set of police that come under the House of Commons and the Senate. It's got its own police. Then you've got, as we mentioned, City of Ottawa Police. You've got the Ontario Provincial Police. You have the RCMP that are very much involved. They do a lot of the policing of the comings and goings at Parliament. And it should be remembered that there were something close to 200 Sûreté du Québec riot police there the day it was broken up because it was an everybody's in effort to break this thing down. If it had been done by police, you might not have needed this emergency order, which is the replacement of the War Measures Act. So it's kind of ironic that Justin Trudeau, whose dad was the last person to invoke the War Measures Act, this new law was put in to make sure that we don't go through the War Measures Act again. And it was Trudeau's son, Justin Trudeau, who pushed this thing through, and now the courts are saying you had no reason to do it. It didn't meet the test of simple reasonability.
And you're saying this will now go to the Supreme Court and it will be forgotten about?
I have every confidence it's going to the Supreme Court. You can't just leave it dangling there, because now we've got two different decisions. We had a commission of inquiry, which is required by the law. So remember, we had a judge, sat down, looked at all of this and said, it's a close call, but, like a baseball umpire, boom, boom.
Yeah.
I'm saying it was okay, but just barely. The Federal Court of Appeal is saying, no, not only is it not reasonable, it's not even close. You didn't meet any of these normal tests for this thing. So the groups like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and others who were fighting for human rights in Canada all the time said they were relieved because they saw that the courts listened to them when they said there's no proof that this was required. And before you start taking away people's rights holus bolus, you better have a darn good reason, and they didn't have one.
Let me move on and get to the last story, and I want to get your take on this. So we finally heard from Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon today reacting to François Legault having resigned. The clip I loved in here was when asked, can we play that whole thing that we played earlier on? So Phil Oche from the Gazette, right, is talking to Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon. And previously, by the way, there was a quote where PSPP says, François Legault stepping down finally shows Quebecers that the next thing we need to do is, of course, have separation, because he pointed to all the things that Quebec asked the feds for. I actually think he used the number. He said 21, and we got none of them, as if that's the real thing that we've all been worried about. But then listen to this exchange, Tom.
Yeah.
Quebecers are known for being ambiguous on many of these questions of sovereignty and federalism.
I'm aware.
Many of them like to sit on the fence, which is what has been the appeal of the CAQ, has been for years. So doesn't that endanger your cause? Quebecers now, theoretically, if you have, for example, a Christine Fréchette or a credible new CAQ leader, and you have a credible new Liberal leader, isn't the entire game being shuffled right under your nose?
Your question is fundamental. It's about, are we going to draw conclusions based on reality? Or are we going to keep on telling ourselves stories that we know are not true because we just tested it? So it's a fundamental question. It's a very interesting question. So it's a great time to be interested in politics.
What?
Yeah. What's the matter with you, Aaron? You don't understand a clear answer?
Help me out here, Tom.
What he is trying to say is that if you wake up in the morning and you burn your toast, that is concrete evidence that Quebec has to separate from Canada. You don't understand.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for that, Tom. No.
Well, I mean, this is Paul St. Pierre Plamondon. This guy's never had a job. Okay, let's stop kidding ourselves. He's a very smart guy, but everything in his life is pure theory. So somehow he says we've got to get away from theory and start looking at real facts. Well, here's some real facts. 65% of Quebecers want nothing whatsoever to do with a referendum. So in the question that Phil Oche was asking, he talked about somebody like Christine Fréchette. Christine Fréchette, it should be borne in mind, she walked away from a job. She was a senior political staffer for the Parti Québécois, and she had just seen enough of their policies, their intolerance. She just said, I'm leaving this stuff. She went over to the CAQ for the reasons that we know. She is the best minister that Legault has. And if she wins, it could change the game because the CAQ would become liberal light. I mean, they, in terms of social policy, they'd no longer have the right-wing nut bar wing running the party. But speaking of that wing, there is going to be a very hard push of a lot of them to try to get Simon-Jeannin Barrette in. Look, I know this is wishful thinking, but if there were only some way for Jeannin Barrette to win, and in that case, all the reasonable people in the CAQ, and there are lots of them, would say, okay, bye-bye, we're going. We're looking for another place to work in politics and to try to make Quebec a better place, and that becomes the Libs. And you'd think that maybe Mr. Duhem of the Conservatives would be starting to think the same thing. I mean, do you get to the point where you just say, no, I want those 12% and 0 seats because they're very important to me? Or do you say, you know what? In terms of the economy, I'm not that far apart from the Libs. On social policy, maybe some bigger differences, but I think we could probably sit down and start working together. I think that that's what's got to happen, because otherwise, the option that is only supported by a third of Quebecers, but because all the other parties are fracturing the vote so much, they get back in, we have another referendum, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. They won't be shy about spending hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to try to convince taxpayers that we absolutely need to split from Canada, to say nothing about all of the upheaval that it represents economically, socially, in terms of the families and the workplaces across the province. Anybody who's been through one of these referendums, Aaron, knows that they're really lousy. But I'm not going to stop Paul St. Pierre Plamondon because it's not a reality that he's really that familiar with.
We will leave it at that. Tom, appreciate it. Thank you so much. You have a good weekend.
Unmistakably Canadian.
It's the music that raised you.
The artists raising the bar.
Hi, this is Brian Adams.
Hey, my name's Brett Emmons. I'm from the Glorious Sons.
Hi, I'm Nelly Furtado.
Made in Canada. The station that champions Canadian music.
Loud, proud, and all yours.
No passports required. Just press play.
Tap into Made in Canada now on iHeartRadio.ca
or the free iHeartRadio app.